Welcome back, everyone, to another video as we dive into something kind of different today. Not even sure how much it has to do with history or not, but a lot of you have recommended it. This is from CGP Grey. It's The Rules for Rulers, and it's actually inspired by a book. So I'm curious to see what it's all about, and we'll see if we can find some historical parallels. I really have no idea what I'm getting myself into. So it's got like 18 million views, the original video. So I'm guessing most of you have seen it by now. I'll put the link in the description to the original content if you haven't. And if you want to check out all of their other great content without my commentary. Let's go ahead and dive into the rules for rulers.
Do you want to rule? Do you see the problems in your country and know how to fix them? If only you had the power to do so. Well, you've come to the right place. But before we begin this lesson in political power, ask yourself, why don't rulers see as clearly as you, instead acting in such selfish, self-destructive, short-sighted ways? Are they stupid, these most powerful people in the world, or is it something else?
So one of the things that I've often noticed in my years of following politics here in the United States is that almost every person who runs for office makes promises that they end up not keeping. And I honestly believe that by and large, most of the time, the people who make those promises intend to keep them. But there's a couple of things that happen. Number one, especially if they're an outsider who's never served in that role before. So in other words, if somebody who's running for president has never been president, they have certain ideas about what they can and can't do and what they will and will not be able to accomplish. And they are acting from the outside without knowing certain information. So a lot of times what happens is they get elected with every intention on doing those things they campaigned on, but then they get information they weren't privy to before, didn't have access to before, or they realize that it's not quite as simple to do the things they want to do as they thought it was. And so I think that is part of the problem, is that what we perceive as politicians just being politicians might be the transition that happens from being a private citizen to being a politician, and all the new information and new insight that is gained.
The throne looks omnipotent from afar, but it is not as it seems. Take the throne to act, and the throne acts upon you. Accept that, or turn back now before we discuss the rules for rulers. No matter how bright the rays of any sun king, no man rules alone. A king can't build roads alone, can't enforce laws alone, can't defend the nation or himself alone. The power of a king is not to act, but to get others to act on his behalf.
100% true. And that doesn't matter what form of government you have, right? Whether it's a constitutional monarchy, an absolute dictatorship, a representative republic, whatever it might be, the nature by which you rule might change, and I'm sure he's going to talk about that.
Using the treasure in his vaults. A king needs an army and someone to run it, treasure and someone to collect it, law and someone to enforce it. The individuals needed to make the necessary things happen are the king's keys to power. All the changes you wish to make are but thoughts in your head if the keys will not follow your commands. In a dictatorship where might makes right, the number of keys to power is small, perhaps only a dozen generals, bureaucrats, and regional leaders. Sway them to your side and the power to rule is yours, but never forget, displease them and they will replace you.
That's true. And, you know, in my frame of reference, being someone who's very heavily into studying the British monarchy, for example, because it was seen as treason to take on the monarch directly, because the monarch represented that power and authority that came from God. The keys to power were the people you went after, right? The advisors. And very often you would see in rebellions, when people would rise up in rebellion seemingly against the monarch, they were very clear to express, no, it's not the monarch. We support the king. It's his advisors that need to go. Right? So they would go after those middlemen, those keys to power. But those middlemen were also the people from which the real threat to the monarch would come, right? So when there was a rebellion that might threaten to, usurp the authority of the crown, it usually came from one of those people through which the crown had to rule.
Now, all countries lie on a spectrum, from those where the ruler needs few key supporters to those where the ruler needs many. This foundation of power is why countries are different. Yet many keys or few, the rules are the same. First, get the key supporters on your side. With them, you have the power to act. You have everything. Without them, you have nothing. Now, in order to keep those keys to power, you must, second, control the treasure. You must make sure your treasure is raised and distributed to you for all your hard work and to the keys needed to keep your position.
So I think, for example, in situations like, I don't know a ton about the Roman Empire, for example, but I know in several situations that when somebody was going to seize power in Rome, one of the first things they did was make sure they got control of the treasury, or they made sure they had some way of funding what they were going to do. And sometimes that meant rounding up a bunch of wealthy political enemies and having them offed so you could confiscate their wealth. Same thing happens with Henry VIII, right? He does the dissolution of the monasteries. That's a big accumulation of new wealth, which is going to allow him to hold on to power by buying off key supporters because he is executing so many of his enemies.
This is your true work as a ruler, figuring out how best to raise and distribute resources so as not to topple the house of cards upon which your throne sits. Now you, aspiring benevolent dictator, may want to help your citizens, but your control of the treasure is what attracts rivals, so you must keep those keys loyal. But there's only so much treasure in your vaults, so much wealth your kingdom produces, so beware. Every bit of treasure spent on citizens is treasure not spent on loyalty.
I will say this, as you're watching this, at least this is how I'm feeling. This is all like, oh yeah, that makes total sense, but it's interesting to see it all put together this way, because just think about it. Whatever part of history you're interested in, throughout history, whatever form of government your country has, whatever time frame you know the most about, this applies. It's really quite fascinating.
Thus, doing the right thing, spending the wealth of the nation on the citizens of the nation, hands a tool of power acquisition to your rivals. Treasure poured into roads and universities and hospitals is treasure a rival can promise to key supporters if only they switch sides.
So, something that's coming to mind as I'm watching this is that sometimes you see. So, for example, I think again of the Roman Empire, right? And they did invest very heavily into things like roads and infrastructure, right? Which is why the Roman Empire was so successful for so long and expanded and lasted as long as it did, because they invested in that infrastructure. But they also invested heavily in the military when the time came. Some countries don't do this well. Some countries do really well with one thing or the other. So I think, for example, right now of North Korea, right? It's an absolute dictatorship where you've got most of that money going to the military and the key supporters and things like that, and not being invested back in the country. So you see all of it being about holding on to power and not nearly as much of that going into back to the citizen. So that's an example of where the balance is real heavy on one side versus the other.
Benevolent dictators can spend their take on the citizens, but the keys must get their rewards. For even if you have gathered the most loyal, angelic supporters, they have the same problem as you, just one level down. Being a key to power is a position of power. They too must watch out for rivals from below or above. Thus, the treasure they get must also be spent to maintain their position. The loyal and dim may stay by your side no matter what, but smart key supporters will always watch the balance of power, ready to change allegiance if you look to be the loser in a shifting web of alliances.
And often those key supporters are rivals to each other, and in order to get the support of one, you may necessarily have to side with them against another. So, for example, I think of the 1930s when the National Socialists are coming to power in Germany, and you've got the SS and the SA, which in that case, what you have is you have the building of those key supporters from the ground up. and then eventually kind of pushing their leadership higher and higher and higher until they lead the entire country. But then he's got to deal with the rivalry of a couple of those different factions who have been key supporters in keeping the peace. And so they side with one by eliminating the other.
In countries where the keys are few, the rewards are great, and when violence rules, the most ruthless are attracted, and angels that build good works will lose to devils that don't. So buy all the loyalty you can, because loyalty in dictatorial organizations of all kinds is everything. For the ruler, anyway.
And how do you get loyalty? You can buy it, but you can also build it through fear, right? But as long as you are feared, you're safe. Just like as long as you have money, you're safe.
Thus, the dictatorship exposed. A king who needs his court to raise the treasure to keep the court loyal and keep raising the treasure. This is the self-sustaining core of power. All outside is secondary. Now, a king with many key supporters has real problems. Not just their expense, but also their competing needs and rivalries are difficult to balance. The more complicated the social and financial web between them all, the more able a rival is to sway a critical mass.
Yeah, part of it is just kind of knowing which way the wind blows, right? And understanding what matters. A great example of a monarch who didn't do this well was Nicholas II in Russia, right? He had control of the military, and it was through the military and through his upper class, his people close to him, that he ruled. But he had so little understanding or concern, I don't know, a combination of both maybe, of the masses, that he didn't understand what was happening in his own country, and he didn't see the way things were shifting. I don't know if he was shielded from that by the people who were close to him, or he gave them too much authority to deal with it to where it never really kind of got up to him. But he missed all of that, what was happening, until it was too late. And how does he end up losing his throne? It's when the military, which is the only thing he's got left, when they turn on him, then he's got no one.
The more key supporters a ruler has on average, the shorter their reign. Which brings us to the third rule for rulers: minimize key supporters. If a key in your court becomes unnecessary, his skills no longer required, you must kick him out. After a successful coup, the new dictator will purge some of those who helped him come to power while working with the underlings of the previous dictator, which from the outside seems a terrible idea. Why abandon your fellow revolutionaries? Are the old dictator's supporters not a danger? But the keys necessary to gain power are not the same as those needed to keep it.
100% true. And we've talked about this some in this series on the Scottish Revolution, right? Or Scottish War for Independence, is that in order to take power, or in order to throw off a more powerful leader from another place, like England ruling Scotland, you have to unite everyone in order to gain that power. But once you no longer have a common enemy to fight, now those factions that you united are going to turn on one another, right? Here's a great example of what could have happened in the American Civil War. Let's say the South wins the American Civil War. Well, now you've got the Deep South, what they called the Cotton States, who seceded very clearly and stated very clearly that it was about the preservation of the institution of slavery. But then you had the Upper South. You had Arkansas, Tennessee, Virginia, North Carolina, states where there was legal slavery, but it wasn't nearly as essential to a large portion of the populace. And their reasons for seceding were a little more complicated. Yes, they wanted to protect the institution of slavery, but that in and of itself was not enough to drive them to secession until they saw other factors happening with Lincoln raising troops and things like that. So had the South won the Civil War, now you're going to have an internal struggle over those things, over system of government, over philosophy, over the eventual downfall of slavery in order to become a member of the international community, things like that. But you have to worry about getting power before you then worry about ruling.
Having someone on the payroll who was vital in the past but useless now is the same as spending money on the citizens. Treasure wasted on the irrelevant. And by definition, a dictator that pulls off a coup has promised greater treasure to those switching sides. The size of the vault has not changed, so the treasure must be split among fewer. A dictator that sways the right keys, takes control of the treasure, cuts unnecessary spending, kills unnecessary keys, will have a long and successful career. Seeing the structure unveiled, you might be excited to get started and control a country to the benefit of you and your cronies.
And, it's simple for us to look at that and say, wow, that's just cruel and harsh. And why? But that's how most of humanity has been throughout history, right? The value of human life has not been what it would be to you and I today, especially if you were someone in power. It's just a different way of looking at the world.
Or you might be exhausted, wishing to do good, but seeing the structural difficulties. Now turn to democracy for salvation. So let us discuss rulers as representatives. You again might have grand dreams of the utopia you wish to build, but no man rules alone, and never more so than in democracy. Presidents and prime ministers must negotiate with their senates and parliaments and vice versa, and they all have their own key supporters to manage. In a well-designed democracy, power is fractured among many and is taken not with force, but with words, meaning you must get thousands or millions of citizens to, if not like you on election day, at least like you better than the alternative.
And that is the real key here that we have to keep in mind, especially here in the U.S. where we have basically a two-party system. It's really not about winning with your ideas. It's about being better than the alternative. Probably no better example of that than the 2016 election, when I think a lot of people held their nose and voted for what they saw as the lesser of two evils. And on both sides, they did that. And it's a tough way to look at things, but really that's what it's about. And it's the philosophy that goes along with the joke where you're like, if I'm walking along with you and we encounter a bear in the woods, I don't have to be faster than the bear. I just have to be faster than you. Same thing applies in elections. I don't have to win people over because they love me. I just have to be better than you.
With so many voters and such fractured power, it's impossible to, as a dictator would, follow these rules and buy loyalty. Or is it? Of course not. Don't think of citizens as individuals with their individual desires, but instead as divided into blocks.
Yep.
The elderly or homeowners or business owners or the poor. Blocks you can reward as a group.
So, a great game, it's weird to talk about a computer game that really gives you a great perspective on all this stuff they're talking about. There's a game called Democracy where you actually, it's basically just like you're looking at stuff on a screen, like all these sorts of things, right? And every decision that you make will affect all these different blocks in different ways. It'll move one up higher or move one down lower, and it shows you perfectly how this works, right? Everything I do is going to appeal to one group but be viewed negatively by another group, and I have to balance all of that.
Democracies have wildly complicated tax codes and laws, not as accident, but as reward for the blocks that get and keep the ruling representatives in power. Farming subsidies, for example, have nothing to do with the food a nation needs, but entirely with how key the vote of the farming bloc is. Countries where farmers' votes don't swing elections don't have farming subsidies. If a bloc doesn't vote, such as younger citizens, then no need to divert rewards their way. Even if large in number, they are irrelevant to gaining power.
Yep.
Which is good news for you. One less block to sway, and the treasure you give your key blocks has to come from somewhere. If you want long years in office, Rule 3 is your friend in a democracy just as much as a dictatorship. You can't eliminate those who don't vote for you, but there is still much you can do. Once in power, make it easier for your key blocks to vote and harder for others.
And there's a reason why, for example, because we have a primary system here in the United States, why you so often see a shift in the focus of a candidate in terms of the policies that they're talking about, right? So, if, for example, I'm running for the nomination to be president for the Democratic Party, I'm going to appeal to the base, right? I have to appeal to the voters who vote in Democratic parties, which means I'm probably going to focus a little heavier on more left-leaning issues, more liberal, more progressive agenda. But then once I get into a general election, now it all becomes about keeping my base happy, but also appealing to those independents who are going to decide the election. And that means I need to start to shift a little bit more toward the center. It doesn't mean I change what I believe in. It might change, though, what I focus on and what I talk about, appealing to those blocks.
Establish voting systems that reduce the number of blocks you need to win. The more rivals you get. Very handy indeed. Draw election borders to predetermine the results for you or your cronies, and have party pre-elections with Byzantine rules to determine who blocks even can vote for. Mix and match the above for even better power perpetuation. When approval ratings couldn't be lower, yet re-election rates couldn't be higher, you'll know you've succeeded. Now, enough with thinking about the citizens.
Isn't that a great point? Very consistently for a long, long time here in the United States, congressional approval rating, the approval rating that people have for our Congress, our House and Senate, is always like 15, 20, 25%. It's always really, really bad. And yet when it comes time for election, they almost all get reelected if they're running for reelection. It's crazy.
Even in a democracy, there still are very influential individual key supporters you need on your side, because their money or influence or favors keeps you in power. While you can't just promise to give them treasure directly, as a dictator would, you can create loopholes for their investments, pass laws that they've written, or print get-out-of-jail-free cards for their actions.
Yep.
Not a wheelbarrow of gold to the door, but contracts for their business. You as a ruler do have roads to build, or computers to maintain, or buildings to reconstruct.
So, and you might say, well, that's bribery, that's cronyism, that's not legal. It is. It's just you have to know what the laws are and how to get around them and how to do those things. Now, sometimes people just ignore the law anyway, but for the most part, there's plenty of this going on a legal basis.
No man rules alone, after all. Or you could take the moral path and ignore the big keys, but you'll fight against those who didn't. Good luck with that. Corruption is not some kind of petty crime, but rather a tool of power in democracies and dictatorships. But more on that another time.
And it's not always directly corrupt. Sometimes it's just about investing back in those key supporters, right? So here where I live, for decades, we have an Air Force Reserve base at the Youngstown Warren Regional Airport that's nearby. They fly C-130s, those big transport military planes. And for decades, there have been concerns that the base was going to get closed. And they had all those rounds of base closures where they were consolidating and shutting down things. And one of the most important factors in being the congressman who represented this district was how you kept that base open. And so it was constantly in the news. What are you doing to make sure the Youngstown Air Base doesn't get shut down? That was one of those like non-negotiable things, right? We're electing a representative to go and represent us in Congress, yes, and they're voting on bills that affect the entire country. But your constituency, the people who elected you, they're concerned about what you're going to do in Washington to make sure our base stays open. So there's all of that going on. And whatever district you're in, there are air bases for you, right? It might not be an air base. It might be a factory of some kind. It might be some military contract, whatever it might be.
So accept the favors, sway the key blocks, and you will get into power, ruling with actions that look contradictory and stupid to those who don't understand the game, privately helping a powerful industry you publicly denounced, or passing laws that hurt a bloc that voted for you. But your job isn't to have a consistent, understandable ruling policy, but to balance the interests of your keys to power, big and small. That is how you stay in office. Now, with all this headache of being a representative, you may wonder, looking at Rule 3, why couldn't you skip all this block-building, favor-trading nonsense and just bribe the army to take power? We must finally turn to taxes and revolts. You must understand Rule 2 and how the treasure is raised and used to hold a country together. If we graph the tax rate of countries versus the number of key supporters the ruler needs, there's a clear relationship. More democracy, lower taxes. If you're sitting comfortably in a cushy democracy, you may scoff at this, but your fellow citizens who don't earn enough don't pay income taxes and get rebates, bringing the average tax rate down. In dictatorships, this doesn't happen. Dictatorships often forego tax paperwork in favor of just taking wealth directly. It's common for the dictator to force farmers to sell their produce to him for little, then turn around and sell it on the open market, pocketing the difference at an unthinkably high equivalent tax rate. So taxes in democracies are low in comparison to dictatorships. But why do representatives lower their take? Well, cutting taxes is a crowd pleaser.
It's an example of giving money to key supporters, right? Is lowering taxes. More money in your pocket. And it works both ways, right? Offering new benefits, offering things like, say, I'm going to wipe out student loan debt. And I only use that as an example because I'm not trying to criticize or speak out in favor of one thing or the other. I'm just saying these are some of the common ones you're hearing about right now, right? And that's going to appeal to a different block of people, but that's another way of putting money back into their pockets from the Treasury.
Dictators have no need to please the crowds and thus can take a large percentage from their poor citizens to pay key supporters. But representatives in a democracy can take a smaller percentage from each to pay their key supporters because their educated, freer citizens are more productive than peasants. For rulers in a democracy, the more productivity, the better, which is why they build universities and hospitals and roads and grant freedoms.
Right, because 10% of 1,000,000 is better than 30% of 100,000, right? So it's all about balancing the percentage versus the overall pie that's available.
Not just out of the goodness of their hearts, but because it increases citizen productiveness, which increases treasure for the ruler and their key supporters, even when a lower percentage is taken. Democracies are better places to live than dictatorships, not because representatives are better people, but because their needs happen to be aligned with a large portion of the population. The things that make citizens more productive also make their lives better. Representatives want everyone productive, so everyone gets highways. The worst dictators are those whose incentives are aligned with the fewest citizens, those who have the fewest keys to power.
Yep.
This explains why the worst dictatorships have something in common: gold or oil or diamonds or similar. If the wealth of a nation is mostly dug out of the ground, it's a terrible place to live because a gold mine can run with dying slaves and still produce great treasure. Oil is harder, but luckily foreign companies can extract and refine it without any citizen involvement. With citizens outside this cycle, they can be ignored while the ruler is rewarded and the keys to power kept loyal. Thus, we live in a world where the best, smartest democracies are stable, the worst, richest dictatorships are stable, and in between is a valley of revolution. The resource-rich dictators build roads only from their ports to their resources and from their palace to the airport, and the people stay quiet not because this is fine or even because they're scared, but because the cold truth is starving, disconnected illiterates don't make good revolutionaries.
Right.
Now, a middling dictator without resources must, as mentioned before, take a large amount of wealth directly from his poor farmers and factory workers. Thus, two roads won't do, and so he must maintain some minimums of life for the citizens. But keeping the workforce somewhat connected and somewhat educated and somewhat healthy makes them more able to revolt.
The more enlightened they are, the more educated they are, the more aware they are, the more likely they are to rise up and want better.
Now understand, the romantic image of the people storming the gates and overthrowing their dictator is mostly a fantasy. If you run a middling dictatorship, the people only storm the palace when the army lets them to remove you because you lost control over your keys and are being...
So what he's saying there is it's not the people themselves who have risen up on their own. It's those key supporters who have incited the people to rise up, or who give the opportunity for the people to do what they otherwise couldn't do because they are in that position, right? What happened with the Roman Empire, for example? How often was it the mob directly that overthrew the emperor? No, it wasn't. It was the people closest to the emperor who assassinated him, or who kind of organized a coup, or who took power using the military. It very rarely is going to be just the mob rising up.
Being replaced. This is why, after popular revolts in middling dictatorships, the new ruler is often the same as the old, if not worse. The people didn't replace the king, the court replaced the king, using the people's protest they let happen to do it.
So true.
The very things a benevolent dictator wants to build to cross this valley take treasure away from the keys to power and make the citizens more able to revolt, often ending in a stronger ruler, less likely to build bridges and more loyal to his keys. On the other side, the best democracies are stable, not just because the large number of keys and their competing desires makes dictatorial revolt near impossible to organize, but also because the revolt would destroy the very wealth it intended to capture, the high productivity of the citizens. Plus, those helping the would-be dictator in a democracy know he plans to cull key supporters once in power. That's what a coup is. So potential key supporters must weigh the probability of surviving the cull and getting the rewards versus the risk of being on the outside of a dictatorship they helped create.
Look, for example, at the rise of the Soviet Union, right? That's what happened. For all of this applies in that situation. First, you have a dictator in the form of Nicholas II who gets overthrown by united groups who then, once they have overthrown their common enemy, now they turn on each other. You have the whites and the reds, right? And now they're going to go after each other. And then within the reds, once they come to power, there's going to be further purging and further culling of the leadership. So it's all going down from a large group to a smaller group. Man, this is all so brilliant and so well done, and I can think of a million different applications for where this is true. And I would love for you guys, when the video is over, to give me your examples of things that jumped out at you from the things that you know and love about history.
In a stable democracy, that's a terrible gamble. Maybe you'll be incredibly wealthy, but probably you'll be dead and have made the lives of everyone you know worse. The math says no. Being on the right side of a coup in a dictatorship means having the resources to get you and your family what the peasants lack: healthcare, education, quality of life. This is what makes the competition for power so fierce. But in a democracy, most already have these things, so why risk it? So the more the wealth of a nation comes from the productive citizens of the nation, the more the power gets spread out, and the more the ruler must maintain the quality of life for those citizens. The less. Now, if a stable democracy becomes very poor, or if a resource that dwarfs the productivity of the citizens is found, the odds of this gamble change and make it more possible for a small group to seize power. Because if the current quality of life is terrible, or the wealth not dependent on the citizens, coups are worth the risk. When democracies fall, these are usually the reasons.
Yeah.
These rules for rulers explain not only why some men are monsters and others are merciful, but everything about politics, from war to foreign aid to political dynasties to corruption,
100%.
All of which we can talk about at another time. But for now, you aspiring ruler may be disgusted by the world of politics and have decided to avoid it entirely. But you cannot, for rulers come in many forms. Yes, kings, presidents, and prime ministers, but also deans, dons, mayors, chairs, chiefs, These rules apply to all and explain their actions.
Yeah.
From the CEO of the largest global corporate conglomerate who must keep his board happy to the chair of the smallest homeowners association, managing votes and spending membership fees. You cannot escape structures of power. You can only turn a blind eye to understanding them. And if you ever want the change you dream about, there's a zeroth rule you cannot ignore. Without power, you can affect nothing.
Yep.
You may not like these rules, but surely better you on the throne than someone else. And who knows, maybe you'll be different.
That was really good. I enjoyed that a lot. And boy, there's just so many applications to this. And honestly, this is one I'll probably go back and watch a couple more times because I want to digest this a little more and think about what this means, because I feel like this is the kind of stuff, and I know it's based on a book. He mentions in there what the book is. From the Dictator's Handbook is the name of the book. I feel like, boy, this is the kind of thing that could really help me to digest parts of history a little better and understand the dynamics at play here. So great stuff. If you like that and you want to see more like that, if you have other suggestions, let me know in the comment section below. And I'm off to Tennessee today. By the time you see this, I'll already be there. Hope to meet some of you this weekend at the Shiloh battlefield. Thanks for watching.